And finally, to discuss the main topics of today, I'm now joined by Garvan Walshe, CEO of Article 7, Intelligence for Democrats. Good evening, and thank you for being with us on World News Tonight. A lot on the roster with G7 and the latest developments on Iran.
Indeed, good evening.
So, the G7 summit was supposed to focus mostly on Ukraine, at least that was the idea, and the events in the Middle East ended up as much of the discussion. Did Kyiv manage to stay on Trump's agenda? What do you think?
It seems a little bit, but mostly Iran seems to have taken it over. There is this deal that Trump has made with Iran that very much looks like a series of American concessions. This is very much the big news of the day. Trump has said he wants to focus on Ukraine, but it's hard to see what he can do in this situation, even though he's been impressed, I think, by recent changes in the battlefield situation and Ukrainian military successes, particularly in medium and deep strike.
Zelensky offered again to meet Putin. Then we had another rejection coming from the Russian side. European leaders, on the other hand, are trying to convince President Donald Trump to really push for that meeting to take place. President Zelensky is hopeful that it's going to take place before winter. What's your best guess? Is this summit actually possible?
I think here Zelensky knows that he's negotiating from an increasingly strong position, and that's why he's repeating his offers to negotiate with Putin. He knows that Putin is in a very, very difficult situation now. His oil refineries are being blown up by Ukrainians. His soldiers are being killed by the tens of thousands. They don't have a response to Ukraine's new type of drone warfare, and it's getting much more difficult to manage the Russian economy. All these things are putting pressure on Putin, but obviously he doesn't want to back down. So Zelensky is trying to force him into a very uncomfortable situation, and Putin is trying to avoid this as much as possible.
Yes, indeed. We've actually seen Alexander Lukashenko, who walked back on his words previously following the attack on the Moscow refinery. Germany's foreign minister said that peace talks are possible to take place this summer. But we've spoken about this multiple times here on TVP World. Do you think that Russia got to a point in time where they are ready to negotiate and sit by the table, for example, with Volodymyr Zelensky, the European leaders, and Donald Trump?
Well, the thing is, it's not clear what Russia would negotiate about, because Ukraine wants its territory back. It now thinks it's in a position where it's starting to get the upper hand. It doesn't have a reason to stop the war effort. It should press its advantage. It's coming quite close to being able to put a significant squeeze on Crimea, on fuel supplies and other even water supplies to the place. This is going to make it harder to defend. The same thing will go for Russian forces in the Donbass, though obviously they have stronger links into Russia there, and it's much harder to dislodge them from that position. But Ukraine wants its territory back. Zelensky cannot give up the territory without a constitutional amendment. It's unlikely that Ukrainians who've been fighting and dying for longer than the First World War would accept an agreement that didn't involve a full Russian withdrawal. So it's difficult to see Putin agreeing to such a withdrawal, because it's unlikely that he can continue in power if he does agree to one. At the moment, it's a question of more pressure, and let's keep piling up that pressure on the Russians. Let's make it more and more uncomfortable for Putin. But I don't think he's likely to concede. Ultimately, he would have to be forced to do this by his own domestic situation. I don't think we're there yet. We're probably 18 months to 2 years, if things go well for Ukraine, before getting to that kind of situation. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I hope Russia collapses more quickly than that, but I think we've got to be realistic here. And of course, like all wars, enemies adapt. So at the moment, Ukraine has the upper hand, but there's no reason why Russia wouldn't be able to change and develop its own tactics. This war has been a series of offensives and counteroffensives, and we need to be careful about not getting our emotions running away with us. In reality, we see Ukraine having a notable advantage at the moment on the battlefield, but it will need to maintain that advantage for a very long period of time before it begins to press severely on the Russian military operation.
We've heard from President Macron, who said that the future negotiations could potentially involve the U.S., Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. With the G7, the shape of thereof, and how things are shaping up after the first day, when we saw all these leaders sit by the round table, do you think it possible for that sort of format to emerge?
Well, it's possible, but it's not clear that's the best format at this point. There are far too many people involved. Obviously, if the Americans are involved because of Trump's pro-Russian angle, it would be important to involve the Europeans too. The only other possible format would be a direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiation without any external powers. But a format involving Europe, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine is relatively unwieldy. Really, will be about the belligerents, and then with the belligerents obviously receiving support from their allies, but it's not clear that it makes sense to have those other countries in at the negotiating table as well.
Mm-hmm. We've heard from President Trump. He said that he could soon restore the sanctions on Russian oil shipments. You mentioned additional pressure to be applied to Moscow in order to force them into negotiations. Do you think that the situation in Iran and this interim deal, which is supposed to be signed on Friday, is going to open a new bandwidth for the U.S. to focus more on Ukraine?
Well, Trump has said he will lift sanctions on Iranian oil, so that will help the oil markets a bit if that actually happens. And this would allow the reimposition of sanctions on Russia. But what are even more effective than these traditional sanctions are what Zelensky calls Ukraine's long-range sanctions, which is the program of strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. They've really started putting inroads into Russian oil production, and as a result, the Russians are finding it difficult to even supply their own cities with oil at the moment. So that matters more, I think. Whether we actually want American bandwidth focusing on a Ukraine peace deal is another question. Donald Trump has, if anything, been on the pro-Russian side for the last 9 months, at least since Zelensky's Oval Office meeting. So maybe we're better off with the Americans not being involved here. What they are needed still for is to provide intelligence support and missile defense, though Ukraine is now saying that it's being able to make significant progress with its own missile defense and able to, it hopes to be able to field missile interceptors by the winter. That's going to be critical if Ukraine is going to survive another Russian assault on its energy system and its heating system.
Mm-hmm. Donald Trump said that Russia should make a deal. At the same time, we've heard him insisting that the war is not America's responsibility. How are those mixed signals being read by both sides, by Moscow and by Kyiv?
I think anyone sensible understands that Trump will say one thing and then contradict himself, often in the same sentence or 5 minutes later. It's very hard to take any of those signals seriously. The serious signals are things like the U.S. decision to cancel deployments of American forces, to reduce missile support for Europe. That's the serious part of American policy. That's the most concerning part. What Trump happens to say one day or another is less important than what the administration is actually doing, and some of what it's doing is very damaging to European security.
Mm-hmm. And finally, before our time on the program runs out, we know that the EU has opened the first accession cluster for both Ukraine and Moldova after a long wait. Is this a meaningful step forward, or is this mostly a political signal? How do you read into this?
This means that negotiations on the detail of EU enlargement can get going. This is the first so-called cluster, which is about the rule of law, anti-corruption, the so-called fundamentals. But it looks like they may open other clusters to do with economic integration, the environment, other kinds of issues in the next few months as well. This is where you really get down to the detail of implementing European legislation, of transposing it into the domestic legal code, of setting up the government agencies that are needed to bring about convergence between the state that is joining the EU and the EU itself. These are all the things that need to be done for an accession process to happen, and it's a very good signal that we're now getting into the serious detail of these negotiations. What matters more than general promises of accession are specific commitments and specific work to bring Ukraine and Moldova's economies and societies into closer coordination with the European mainstream.
Step by step will take us a long way. Garvan, great to have you back on the show. Thank you so much. Garvan Walshe, CEO of Article 7 Intelligence for Democrats, was my guest. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight. Thank you for joining me. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features. But until then, have a good one.